Obrigado por esta oportunidade de discutir alguns dos meus pensamentos sobre os animais e o império. Eu literalmente passei décadas sem praticar o português falado, então, por favor, perdoe o fato que esta palestra será dada em inglês, mas vou responder a perguntas tanto em português como em inglês. Vamos começar a nossa jornada. At its core, imperialism is an effort to restrict agency and choice, an effort by one entity to dominate another. It is the embodied tragedy of Hegel's Lord Bondsman or master slave dialectic. In human affairs, this imperial and imperious dialectic may be political, cultural, or economic. And after 1492, it often involved Europeans prejudicially imposing their will on their fellow human beings. But since the economic material resources of empire are drawn from a natural world in which we humans are embodied, imperialism involves geographies, environments, and ecosystems. And just as people are often invidiously reduced to human resources, other sentient, animated beings, animals, are reduced to resources too. They are subject to imperialism, even as humans are subject to imperialism. Non-human animals have played a role globally in the construction of empires. They are used as sources of food and clothing, and also as resources in displays of power. Collected by emperors and menageries, they were also used to identify the nobility of imperial warriors, from the caballero of Iberia to the Aztec warrior compared to a jaguar or an eagle. Non-human animals can also be used as laborers, as beasts of burden, or weaponized in hunts and in warfare. And this often leads to some recognition of their agency, as we humans learn to work with their behaviors to our benefit, force behaviors on them, or witness their resistance to our demands. We may then think about these other beings, these animals, in all sorts of ways, becoming fond or resentful of them, and even comparing their abilities and behaviors to ours. In the words of anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, animals are good to think. And from thinking about other animals, a countercultural path to dominion, to imperio, may also arise. When looking at animals as resources and labor, we are ensnared in a web of entanglements. The sheep of Iberia produced wool and meat. Like horses, they might be borrowed by other cultures, and today's Navajo or Diné Churro sheep is descended from the Chura sheep of Iberia. The Inca Empire, another empire, had a source of fabric in the llama, who could also be a beast of burden like a donkey. The llama might also be sacrificed in religious ritual and was thereby subject to multiple human interpretations and impositions. In today's Andes, indigenous Americans will often name llamas, while guinea pigs who are eaten are not named. Llamas become members of the family, like the fictional Sancho Panza's donkey, El Rucio, in Cervantes' Don Quixote. Empires use animals as resources, but also as labor, including weaponized labor and displays of power. For approximately 100 years, from the 1750s to the 1850s, the Comanche nation developed a highly mobile imperial presence on the borders of the Spanish Empire, and later the borders of Mexico and the United States in North America. They did this with the horse as weaponized labor and in impressive displays of wealth through the accumulation of horses to measure their wealth. Empires of all sorts, European or otherwise, are entangled in relationships with other animals, and it should not be forgotten that the Comanche hunted buffalo from horseback. In her comprehensive book, which recently came out, The Tame and the Wild, historian Marcy Norton has argued that early modern Europeans saw horses and dogs as vassals in the hunt and warfare, valued but subordinated. Sentient allies, yes, but thought of as the knight serving a count. Other people could be seen in this light as well, with the term vassal, of course, normally applied to the human feudal system and to personalized bonds of honor between superior and subordinated noble. In human empires, 16th century Spaniards relied on the Tlaxcaltecan nobles in Mexico, while Indians from South Asia played a similar role for the British Empire throughout the span of its existence. From Burma, now Myanmar, to Africa and Europe, Indians were subalterns. Here on the screen, you see the subalterns on horseback in Europe during World War I. Of course, those who are subordinated can rebel, from people to non-human animals. And Spaniards use the term cimarron to describe human and animal rebels, renegades alike. This was and can continue to be, of course, an invidious comparison. But imperial efforts at domination entangled the fates of sentient, rational, enslaved humans and sentient, non-human animals. In her excellent Afro Dog, Blackness and the Animal Question, Bénédicte Boisseron states the problem very well. Quote, while questioning the animal-human divide is essential to animal rights activism, contesting the divide with racial paradigm indeed carries the potential effect of reinscribing a discriminative approach that one had sought to reject in the first place. On the other hand, there is no denying that there are important parallels to be drawn between the rationale behind opposing animal oppression and that behind condemning discrimination against minorities. End of quote. So she sees the parallels as they've played out. Agency and resistance were present in the Palmares of Zumbi, in Gaspayanga's community of San Lorenzo in New Spain, and in the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857 in India. Verbalized, reflected policies developed by those movements were human acts of rebellion. At the non-human level, agency and resistance to imperial imposition is also present in runaway horses and in runaway cattle. They do not abstract questions of justice, these feeling, experiencing emotions, animals. They do not abstract questions of justice and equity in manifestos, but they rebel. From rational humans to sentient livestock, empire has always had its resistors. So, as illustrated by previous slides, from the Mongols of Chinggis Khan, who wasn't in one of the slides, to the Comanche nation, horses have played major roles in empire. And in 19th century Southern Africa, Sandra Swart has shown that the Basotho people, who formed an early alliance with the British, leading to the continued existence of an independent Lesotho today, also readily adopted the horse. The horse was ridden by women spirit mediums, as portrayed there, as well as by male nobles to display power, status, prowess. Animals build empires, European or otherwise, and often are used in similar ways across human cultures and are used in India as well as in Britain. Thus, emperors from Mexico to Europe have maintained menageries to exhibit their control over nature itself, with none more impressive, perhaps, than that of Moctezuma II in Tenochtitlan, in what became Nueva España. In Mughal India, elephants were not only used in war and to clear forest, but also to display impressively, as portrayed on the screen. There was a long-standing tradition here, and when a Castilian embassy, including Ruy González de Clavijo, visited Emir Timur in Samarkand around 1400, he noted painted and caparisoned war elephants in attendance on that Turco-Mongol emperor. When Moctezuma kept both humans and non-human animals in his zoo, as Europeans would, again, very unfortunately do in the 19th century as well, and when Timur or the Mughal emperors used elephants to display might, we are forced to think about our relationship to other animals and to their status in our world and in the breadth of nature itself. The daughter of an apothecary, the 16th century Spanish intellectual, Oliva Sabuku, thought we might learn to channel our emotions constructively and benevolently by observing the feelings of other animals through their behaviors. She was really a pioneering ethologist, an animal behavioralist, and comparative psychologist in her day. She thought about non-human animals to ponder how we might behave and perhaps improve our behavior. Might animals therefore show another path, a path beyond efforts to dominate? Is nature itself not only nature red in tooth and claw, a world of violence and strife, as the 19th century English poet Alfred Lord Tennyson would have it? Might nature's path be more benevolent, more altruistic? Recently, biology has been increasingly focused on cooperation in social animals, in behaviors like food sharing and team efforts in the hunt among our chimpanzee cousins. Nature is at least as symbiotic and cooperative as Prince Peter Kropotkin, author of the 1902 Darwinian anarchist tract Mutual Aid, would have it. Nature is not solely defined by violence, and early moderns could see this too. San Martín de Porres embodied the prophet Isaiah's peaceable kingdom when he fed a dog, a cat, and a mouse at his Dominican convent. A little aside, he also was reputed to have raised a dog from the dead and to be able to walk peacefully side by side with un toro bravo, a bull for the arena. I think I am a skeptic, I am a materialist. I think he too had a really good working sense of animal behavior and ethology. And his miracles reflect that to a large extent. So there's San Martin. Actually, one of the images, the first image closer to the passage, is perhaps from life. It dates back to around the time of his death. San Martin also pointed to a blending of cultural traditions, African and European, and a peaceful devaluing of hierarchy. As a healer, he cared for Spaniards, indigenous Americans, Africans, and non-human animals alike He actually ran a veterinary, he was a Dominican, he ran a veterinary hospital at his sister's house. I would argue that San Martin recognized a difference in degree rather than kind in his hierarchical world, and that harmony might be achieved to the mutual benefit of all. Likewise, Africans, Europeans, and indigenous Americans did have some different cultural perceptions regarding non-human animals, but their perceptions could also meet and hybridize, given human commonalities in cognition, feeling, and perception. Some indigenous Americans might think of other animals as peers, whom you fed, loved, and chose not to eat. The Ege of the greater Caribbean basin, while other were these animals, they were family members. Other animals were co-inhabitants of the world, but you could hunt them and eat them. You were taught, however, to use them with respect. Some Asians, also in another part of the world, might contemplate reincarnation across species and compassion across species. But hierarchy, with humans placed above other animals, was usually invoked as well in the system of reincarnation. It is better to be incarnated as a human than even a high-ranking animal like a monkey or an elephant. Likewise, Europeans and Middle Easterners might see themselves as granted dominion over nature and other animals, but this did not automatically lead to cruelty and cruel domination, never taking other animals' feelings and sentience into account. Aristotle himself, used in both the Christian and Islamic worlds, said in the Politics that other animals felt and had voice to communicate pleasure and pain, and that they could be social too. He just emphasized that humans had speech and reason, logic or logos, the Greek word that was used in that capacity, to discuss justice and equity in society. This is a hierarchy, but it is a difference in degree rather than kind, which of course is Darwin's term, that where animals are concerned, including human beings, the difference exists in degree, not kind, with absolute barriers between the two. Christianity and Islam did further the distance, making it more than a difference in degree, by claiming that humans have immortal souls, breaking free of cycles of life and death that claim both humans and other animals in sacrifice, for example, among the Aztecs and also in the Inca Empire. Christianity and Islam argued for a difference in kind, that we are not like the other animals. However, individuals like San Martin de Porres and San Francisco, St. Francis, treaded a delicate line, a transmutable boundary between humans and other animals that Christianity and Islam could not entirely eliminate, a difference in degree that Christianity and Islam could not entirely eliminate. After all, Muhammad had his friend, the talking donkey Yafur, according to Shiite tradition. And in Surah 6 of the Quran itself, it is written, quote, "There is not an animal in the earth, nor a flying creature flying on two wings, but they are peoples like unto you. We have neglected nothing in the book of our decrees, then unto their Lord they will be gathered." Does this mean that non-human animals have prophets, go to heaven? That has been debated in Islam. Different human cultures and empires globally developed variations on a hierarchy of animals, where some animals receive preferential treatment and others might be resources and objects. After 1492, these cultures and empires became entangled as never before. In the transatlantic world, according to Marcy Norton, the pet was born as a blending of companion traditions, with the pet being influenced by Caribbean and Brazilian notions of the animal companion, yege, being like children that you care for. These ideas were transported to Europe with American parrots and monkeys coming to the courts of Europe. At European courts themselves, though, there was the perro de falda, the lapdog, called spaniel, perro de España in England. Europeans were familiar with these special animals as well. Things were complicated, and there was a form of mestizaje or hybridization involving the American, the African, and the European in the shaping of what we think today of as a pet. Globally, Richard Bulliett, in the book Hunters, Herders, and Hamburgers, has indicated that we have entered a post-domestic age today, where the slaughter of animals for food is hidden, and meat only appears packaged and objectified while pets are cherished. In this obvious contradiction and tension between industrialized agriculture and the household pet, veganism and philosophies embracing animal rights rather than animal welfare can be born. Animal welfare is being compassionate to other animals while you still may use them. Animal rights is where you basically will say that other animals should not be used. There is a leveling today beyond that experienced by foragers and hunters. There is, if you will, an effort at democracy in nature, I would say, recognizing, as Spinoza did, that there is no fairness in killing a chicken. We do so, according to Spinoza, because we have the power to do so. As a hungry tiger, according to Spinoza, again, he doesn't use the tiger metaphor, but another animal might use us if they could. If they could. This is imperio, and it lurks behind every bush. That older domestic vision of things, though, that you can be kind and you can use, where animals are both companions and commodities, is found in the thought of the 16th century Portuguese converso physician Garcia da Horta, who most likely traveled to India to escape the suspicions and repressions of the Portuguese Inquisition. He could see the sentience and intelligence in an elephant, even while he could still say that physicians used their ivory in medicine. He could admire and use simultaneously. Likewise, the dialogue he wrote on botanicals and other pharmaceuticals he used in India illustrates the skill and intelligence of a servant assistant he employed named Antonia. She appears in the dialogues. I personally remain uncertain as to whether she was Indian or Portuguese, slave or free, but she was exploited for her intelligence, even as non-human elephants were exploited. This is imperium. Still, in Garcia de Horta, there are inklings of what Richard Grove called green imperialism, with de Horta noting that in capturing elephants in the wild, Indian rulers always released more individuals than they took to keep feral populations for continuous captures. Beyond this drive to sustain resources, individuals like Oliva Sabuco and a soldier poet, João de Brito of Brazil, called on their fellow humans to imitate other animals in compassion, or to show compassion for non-human animals like whales, hunted for their oil beyond sustainability. Ana Camfora, in her book Animals and Society in Brazil from the 16th to 19th centuries, has shown how Brito wrote of a mother whale immolated in defense of her young, as human whalers killed both. In fact, as reiterated recently in 2017 by Peter Salins in the book 1668, The Year of the Animal in France, Europeans lived in a Baroque set of attitudes toward non-human animals. Everything was not encapsulated or included in Rene Descartes' reduction of other animals to stimulus response machines without true feeling. They might be beloved cats wandering at an intellectual salon or kept on display as articles of display in Louis XIV's imperial ambitions exemplified through his royal menagerie. They were vivisected, cut open alive in France, but they were also cherished. Cardinal Richelieu provided for the upkeep of his cats after his death in his last will and testament. The cardinal's cats were all named in the will, and one did bear the intriguing name for a cardinal's cat of Lucifer. The notion of other animals as mere machines only accelerated in Europe with industrialization, Descartes' notion, as horsepower replaced real horses. And Samuel Crompton built a spinning mule, portrayed there on the slide, to replace women as spinsters at their individual wheels. The mule continued to bear people on their backs, but the mule was now being used as a metaphor to describe work done by automation. Artisanry died, and Europeans were brought to labor in factories, as previously slaves had been brought to labor on plantations, supervised, surveilled. The steam locomotive, called the Iron Horse in the United States, started a process of replacing horses. And mules and donkeys were no longer turning mill wheels to grind grain. Non-human animals faded away, with many cities restricting and eliminating the presence of urban pigs and chickens. War was waged on an industrial scale against wolves and other animals in the wild. And where previous Spanish Habsburg kings took pride in lancing boars who turned on them during the hunt, Charles III took pride in continuously, a Bourbon king of Spain, in continuously being provided with flintlock muskets to kill wolves in a type of shooting gallery in the wild. It was almost automated. Indeed, as could be seen by those early 19th century rebels, the Romantics, the wild was being replaced by factories and uncaring, undomesticated scientism rather than science, criticized by romantics like Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, an author who's finally getting her due as a very serious author. Industrialization was an effort at total male-dominated imperio run amok. It prolonged lives and increased human numbers, cheapening labor and providing more cannon fodder on the battlefields. And it increased the misery of non-human animals at the same time, dropping their numbers in the wild through habitat loss and eventually turning them into machines in 20th century factory farms. All this inspired by the very unromantic Descartes and the American B.F. Skinner. Historical animal studies, when it studies empire, must consider all these entanglements, this web. For example, There is the industrialized exploitation of wolves in Great Britain, extirpation of wolves, the land that first brought us industrialization. As Britain enclosed common lands to provide for more sheep, more wool producing machines, just before the birth of the factory, sheep eating wolves also disappeared. Sir Thomas More, in Utopia, noted that sheep were eating people, his metaphor. Well, they also ate wolves. Sheep and mercantile activity in wool and other goods even ate trees, as Britain denuded itself of its forests in order to provide timber for mercantile and naval vessels, including the decimation of the vast Caledonian forest in Scotland that frightened Roman legionnaires, Roman soldiers, when they saw it. Today, Iberia, France, and Italy have some 6,700 to 7,700 wolves, and the 48 contiguous or connected states of the United States only have 5,500 wolves. The total area of those 48 states approaches 8.1 million square kilometers. The total area of Portugal, Spain, France, and Italy is just under 1.5 million square kilometers. Those four countries in Europe, including your own, are home to more wolves in less land than the 48 states of the United States. Of course, there's also Alaska and Hawaii. Hawaii never had wolves. In Alaska, the state of the Alaska, which does have 1.7 million square kilometers, Alaska is the home to 8,000 to 11,000 wolves. But please note, Alaska has less than 1 million people as of 2020, far less than Spain's population alone of 48.6 million people, and Spain lives with 2,000 to 3,000 wolves. So the extirpation or annihilation of wolves in Spain and Portugal and in Italy, and they've been reintroduced in France, never really happened. I remember my tia Piedad, when I visited Portugal as a child, told me in Alto Algarve to avoid this particular set of hills because that was the place of the wolf. And that left an impression on me that, including, and riding a donkey left an impression on me. And it may have helped to shape me. And I was impressed by the fact there were wolves there. In October 2023, The Guardian, the British newspaper The Guardian, reported that a number of Spanish shepherds are relearning old Mesta traditions of relying on herding dogs to guard sheep and cattle. In the Western United States, unfortunately, many, although not all, ranchers simply ask for the elimination of wolves once again, as they have been reintroduced into the United States. Industrial slaughter of the wolf dominates the discourse. However, in opposition to imperial extirpation, a green imperialism remains. And empire building could lead to exotic animals from the far reaches of an empire being put on display in a public zoo to entertain and to educate, often under horrendous conditions early on. Where nation states were being constructed, a certain pride was sometimes developed through thinking about native wildlife. And this could lead to successful efforts to save the buffalo from extinction in the United States, or to once again learn compassion from nature, as demonstrated by Regina Horta Duarte in her study of the Brazilian National Museum in activist biology. Activist biologists existed before Jane Goodall and Edward O. Wilson. And early 20th century Brazil had them in Edgar Roquette Pinto and in Candido de Mel Leitão. In the late 19th century, in the British Empire, colonial subject Ram Brahma Sanyal, who rose to be director of the Calcutta Zoo, usually a British man was director, was an activist biologist who wrote about his efforts to provide enrichment for caged animals and took pride in those who lived long lives in captivity. He actually tried to save a polar bear who was brought by a merchant into India. He failed, and he said in his written works that the polar bear should never have been brought there. And he made sure that monkeys had social companionship when they were being kept at a zoo, and that the cages and confinement areas they were kept in were not overcrowded. He triumphed, actually, at being an early proponent of what is now standard practice in zoos, and in being a colonial subject who rose to the rank of zoo director. And there you can see on the screen, he tried to provide for the mental stimulation of various intelligent animals that were in his care. And you see that with the orangutan and what he wrote about concerning the keeping of orangutans. In the last days of the British Empire, as Tanzania was gaining its independence in the early 1960s, Jane Goodall championed the independence of the chimpanzees of Gombe. She taught science to respect the agency, sentience, and individuality of her subjects, even writing an obituary for the Gombe matriarch Flo that appeared in the Times of London. And that is an image of Flo on screen. She was amazing. They did an autopsy on her body when she died of natural causes. She was probably older than 50 years of age. The average life expectancy for a chimpanzee in the wild is in the 30s. So she did have an amazing life. Respect for other animals is also there in the post-colonial world. Nobel Prize winner Wangari Maathai provided habitat and wildlife corridors for animals, even as her Greenbelt movement empowered women in the Kenyan countryside and provided them and their families with diverse and sustainable food crops. She found compromise and common ground with non-human animals, whom she always saw as more than just resources. Yet, in this period, our period, which the International Union of Geological Sciences has rejected as a new geological epoch, but which many of us still call the Anthropocene, the Earth is increasingly becoming a human anthill. Over 50% of us now inhabit cities. And these urban centers have contributed to the growth of cropland, cutting into pathetic pockets of habitat left other animals. Even though some economists now claim that there are too few of us, there are simply too many of us. And we impoverish this planet in our imperial insatiability. In the words of Marcy Norton, the history of livestock expansion in the Americas is also inextricably bound with the most extreme forms of dispossession, enslavement, land expropriation, ecological destruction, and massacre that anticipated and originated the forms of dispossession that continue into the present. End of quote. From 1990 to 2020, more than 780,000 square kilometers of land were cleared in the Brazilian Amazon, while cattle ranching accounted for 80% of that clearing. This too is imperio. But imperialism, as we have known it, may now be entering its end cycle. Beyond the discipline of climate science, some are now quite seriously arguing that our current global historical moment resembles previous periods of regional societal collapse as a result of ecological changes, human populations exceeding environmental carrying capacity, and a lack of response by squabbling, arguing, selfish elites. This template for social collapse was postulated in 1991 by a historical sociologist named Jack Goldstone, and currently is being championed by an evolutionary biologist and complexity scientist, Peter Turchin, whose book End Times did gain some notoriety. What comes next? Historians do not predict the future, but strong possibilities are mass extinction, scrambles for fresh water, large numbers of climate refugees, and political responses that do not resemble quests for common planetary justice and the common good. Former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis argues that capitalist economies and economics reliant on manufacturing and financing are actually evolving into an economy dominated by the control of rented space. As feudal lords demanded tributary rents from peasants and urban artisanal manufacturers who produced on the land or in chartered cities, vendors, manufacturers, and consumers alike now all pay rents in cash or data mined information to those who control portions of what we call the cloud, that amorphous cloud out there. Varoufakis calls our new information economy techno-feudalism. The barons produce nothing. They control platforms, virtual territories, which may or may not facilitate our production. They thrive in their castles as governments and individuals struggle for material resources in the material world. Where does this leave non-human animals when children are raised on Pokemon animals and other virtual life forms? Well, in North America, they've shown their resilience and their intelligence. Urban raccoons search for their next meal in garbage cans and bird feeders, and they are doing better in many instances than their relatives left behind in the countryside. In the United States, in the state of Illinois, there is a higher raccoon population density in the city of Chicago than in the industrialized monocultural farms of the so-called countryside. There are animal survivors in the midst of our global imperial expansion. There are raccoons, falcons, foxes, coyotes, and deer, as well as rats, pigeons, and sparrows. In Curitiba, Brazil, the survivors, the individuals who have taken advantage of territory that was not there for them before, are the much loved synanthropic capybaras. In recent decades, there have been individuals who have seen great potential and real localized power in cities. This has included mayors like Jaime Lerner of Curitiba, who used sheep to trim park grass in the city, and Michael Bloomberg of New York City, who was honored for his ecological efforts in 2019 by the Wildlife Conservation Society based at New York's Bronx Zoo. And it's become an international society, whereas previously it really was the fund for the Bronx Zoo. Today, Curitiba and New York City take pride in their non-human inhabitants, calling them citizens of New York, citizens of Curitiba, on websites hosted by the city government. A city like Portland, Oregon, in the United States will see itself as habitat and a wildlife corridor for non-humans. And that quote is taken from a Portland city government website. New York City also sponsors over 550 community gardens on city property, 745 school gardens, and over 700 gardens at public housing developments. The human citizens of New York are growing some of their own food, fresh vegetables and fruit, rather than highly processed packaged foods reliant on the high fructose corn syrup and other byproducts of industrial agriculture in the countryside. Of course, most New Yorkers still consume all that, but there's been a growth in this urban gardening. Cities can be greener and incorporate surrounding farmlands, including organic farms like those that surround Curitiba, basically the city. The organic farms of Paraná State are pretty much all around Curitiba. With the presence of some farming, a number of cities are incorporating small bits of self-reliance, agency, and empowerment that define the city-states of previous eras. Just as techno-feudalism is not the world of samurai and knights, the new empowered city is not exactly the city-state that came before, but there is a resemblance, and citizens, human or otherwise, take action rather than waiting for a savior. And there are those in the United States who are waiting for a savior. As demonstrated by architect Stefano Berri, his Bosco Verticale in Milan, birds and insects can live side by side with humans living in towers. The city itself can have a multi-species citizen body. It can make space for the non-human. And I don't mean robots, although they might also be included at some point in the future. This is the dream and vision of a movement called solar punk, still small but growing, that includes a number of Brazilian science fiction writers like Gerson Lodi Ribeiro, and actively tries to incorporate highly sentient, communicative orcas and other animals into their fictional stories and anthologies, one of which is entitled Multi-Species Cities, Solarpunk Urban Futures. While many of the techno-feudal realm may be comfortable with nearly imperial transnational corporations and warring virtual states built on cloud platforms, enticing millions into ugly turmoil, others today are trying to find grassroots empowerment, something democratic, non-imperial, in this era, which most likely will include, unfortunately, waves of extinction. So, if new power configurations loom on the horizon, perhaps one possibility is that some of us, in the midst of global warming and habitat loss, may greet animal survivors into our cities. Ecosystems are being redefined, and it is time to stop seeing what survives and comes to our cities as invasive, to be extirpated. Portuguese philosopher Katia Faria would have us show compassion for other sentient animal life before prioritizing unfeeling ecosystems, as economists prioritize profit. There is a utilitarian struggle against suffering in Faria's work, which continues the work of Jeremy Bentham, Peter Kropotkin, and Peter Singer. Perhaps there will be new republics and guilds in the 21st century to challenge any empire that may remain in other warring states as well. Even anti union corporate behemoth Amazon is now trying to learn to live with a trade union in greater New York City. The old European Middle Ages had its guilds, but it also had its caliphate, which fell apart, its shrinking Byzantine Empire, and a weak Holy Roman Empire. There also was a Republic of Venice, founded in 697 CE, and a Republic of Florence, with its foundation in 1115 CE. Perhaps small republics will be reincarnated in a new way, in some capacity, negotiating and allying with larger entities and incorporating citizens of other species as citizens for the very first time, like the now officially vulnerable, no longer officially endangered Iberian lynx of Portugal and Spain. Comunidades, like the unsuccessful rebels of early 16th century Castilla, might include comuneros now with fur and feathers, citizens subject to restrictions in law, but not forced to labor, provide resources, or entertain. We will have to respect their space and prevent actions by us that might lead to their aggression. Perhaps instead of mutual doom or a continuation of human empires, the future might see at least some multi-species communities. Thank you very much. Muito obrigado.